Darwin's theory of evolution basically tells us this: organisms that are better at reproducing are the ones that end up spreading through the population. It's the reason we have everything from giant sperm whales to tiny killer bacteria. Every life form on this planet has evolved its own way of surviving and reproducing, whatever the cost to other organisms. But for some reason, when we look closely at our own cells, or even cells from any animal or plant, instead of seeing them competing to stay alive, we find them giving up their lives like soldiers, sacrificing themselves for the good of the organism. It's almost like they're being controlled, forced to go against evolution and live a life of military service. In this video, we're going to investigate the puppet masters behind these cells, and try to understand how they've been shaping life on Earth for 3 billion years. First, let me explain what I mean by cells dying like soldiers. All animal and plant cells come with something similar to a self-destruct button, which they press whenever necessary for the organism. This process of self-destruction is called apoptosis, and it claims the lives of 50 to 70 billion of your cells every single day. This might seem like a lot, but it's actually a vital part of a natural recycling process. When one cell becomes too damaged, it needs to be cleared away before another cell can divide and replace it. It's also really important in the structuring of organs and tissues. For example, the reason your brain's wiring is so precise and complex is that excess nerve cells are all carefully whittled away by apoptosis. Apoptosis was a game changer in life's evolution. The organisms that evolved apoptosis are called eukaryotes, and they were able to become bigger, smarter, and more complex. Bacteria didn't evolve apoptosis, leaving them stuck with a more primitive lifestyle. But the problem is that the benefits of apoptosis are at the level of the organism rather than the cells. It's not favourable for cells to accept their own death just for the organism, that is, if they weren't being forced. To investigate what is forcing the cells, let's take a closer look at how apoptosis works. A cell can decide to die either because it can no longer function properly or because of orders from other cells. But in both cases, the apoptosis process is centered at the mitochondria. These organelles usually just generate energy for the cell, but during apoptosis, their outer membranes are ruptured by bursts of chemicals called free radicals. These free radicals then act as signals, activating complex processes in the cell that basically lead to it getting ripped up and recycled. What's interesting here is how important the mitochondria are in this process. It's pretty unusual for the cell's energy generators to take on such a huge role in the cell. By taking on the role of integrating signals for apoptosis, they're basically in charge of whether a cell dies or not. Hopefully you've realized by now that maybe it's the mitochondria that are forcing the cells to die. It's pretty clear who the prime suspect is, but what's the motive behind it all? Remember, when a cell self-destructs, its mitochondria die along with it, making them the victims of their own crime. Maybe killing the cell wasn't their original intention, just an unfortunate, or perhaps extremely fortunate, result of evolution. To understand their true motive, we need to take a flashback to about 4 billion years ago, all the way back to the time of early mitochondria, a time when apoptosis hadn't evolved just yet. You see, the first mitochondria were originally bacteria that found their way inside a host cell. They were able to find shelter inside their host, and in exchange, they generated energy that the host could use to divide and reproduce. This in turn gave the mitochondria more space to divide and move into. The mitochondria and the host were very happy with each other most of the time, helping each other to survive and reproduce. Together, they formed an early eukaryote, the ancestor of all complex life on Earth today. But as in every relationship, conflicts would happen from time to time. To understand why mitochondria force our cells to die today, we need to look at how they first started to clash with their host cell. Sometimes the host cell became damaged, making it less able to use the energy generated by the mitochondria. This made the host cell divide slower, limiting how fast the mitochondria inside could reproduce. Basically, the mitochondria became trapped inside a damaged cell. For a cell, the best way of repairing damage is through cell fusion, merging with another cell and replacing all of its damaged DNA and cell machinery. A repaired cell can then start to divide faster. The problem was that cells didn't like to fuse. In evolutionary terms, cells that didn't preserve their fidelity were disfavored by natural selection. But basically, it boils down to cells not wanting to mix with each other, even if it would allow them to divide faster. This wasn't a problem for the mitochondria, however, since cell fusion wouldn't actually involve them mixing with each other. They could remain separate while the cells themselves merged. We end up with a situation where the mitochondria want to fuse, but the host cell doesn't, even though both parties ultimately want to survive and reproduce. Now, just like before with apoptosis, let's take a closer look at how the mitochondria would behave in such a situation. Normally, in a healthy host cell, the mitochondria generate energy for the host by passing electrons through something called an electron transport chain, and combining these electrons with oxygen to produce water. It's very similar to what happens in a circuit, except the energy isn't used by a bulb to produce light, but by the host cell to divide and reproduce. When the host cell is damaged and slows its energy consumption, the whole circuit becomes blocked up with electrons, causing them to escape uncontrollably. When too many electrons react with oxygen at once, we start to produce dangerous free radicals that burst out of the mitochondria and attack the host cell. Basically, when a host cell gets damaged and slows down its rate of division, its mitochondria produce chemical weapons that attack their host. By offering a choice between mixing with another cell and being obliterated with free radicals, mitochondria could threaten the host cell into cell fusion. This was the original motive of the mitochondria, to escape from a damaged cell by forcing it to fuse with another. Cell fusion actually evolved into what we nowadays call sex. When a sperm and egg cell meet, all that's really happening is two cells mixing together, exactly what we saw in cell fusion. So we can technically say that the origins of apoptosis lie in our mitochondria's sex drive. But that's all beside the point, because we're still missing the final piece of the puzzle. If the mitochondria's motive was to repair a cell through cell fusion, how come free radicals trigger cell death today? Well, if you think about it, fusion and death are the same thing, just in different contexts. Cell fusion is a way of repairing a cell by replacing the damaged parts, whereas cell death is a way of repairing an organism by eliminating the damaged parts. But just like death isn't the best way to repair damage in a single cell, fusion doesn't work very well at the level of the organism. This is the problem that early eukaryotes faced as they came together and formed colonies. Damaged cells that started to fuse with other cells would pose a big threat to the colony, and ultimately themselves. The choice that mitochondria gave wasn't between death and fusion anymore. For the host cell, it was either death of the whole colony, or its own. By accepting its own death, the host not only saved its colony, but also defeated the mitochondria, once and for all. But in a sense, our mitochondria weren't really the bad guys. By forcing ourselves into death, they brought a new meaning to life on this planet, something we can all be grateful for. Fine, mitochondria were really important in the evolution of complex life. How is this all relevant to us today, though? It's relevant because the role of mitochondria in apoptosis isn't just a thing of the past. It continues in our bodies as a remnant of evolution.
The best example of how important this is what you get when apoptosis goes wrong. When the DNA of one of your cells gets damaged, we call it a mutation, and in the right genes and the right places, mutations can allow a cell to escape the clutches of their mitochondria.
These cells are able to revert back to a time before apoptosis, a time when the only purpose of life was to survive and reproduce. Just like bacteria, these cells divide rapidly and spread throughout the body, leaving us with a disease that we are all too familiar with: cancer. The opposite of this, when our mitochondria become too strict with our cells, can also be harmful for us.
By triggering apoptosis more and more often over time, malfunctioning mitochondria may actually play a central role in aging. The point I'm trying to make is that our evolutionary history has consequences for our biology today. If we really want to tackle big issues like cancer and aging, it might not hurt to better understand our past.